begin. We're going to begin with the performance of the Chromatic Fantasy and Fugue of J.S. Bach, a piece he wrote sometime between 1717 and 1725. He would have been between the ages of 32 and 37, 38, 32 and 32 and 40. And the reason we're beginning with this is because of the nature of what we're going to be discussing. The presentation describes the successful intervention by Lyndon LaRouche against an organization called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. But that organization today is the entire culture that you live in. And so in order to demonstrate the success of LaRouche's intervention, we begin with the performance by Andras Schiff of the Chromatic Fantasy and Fugue. It was done at the Green Space downtown here, their own green space, on the occasion of a WQXR sponsored program. Okay. you have the Landowska?
Yeah.
Just play me the beginning of that. This is a contrasting performance by Wanda Landowska, and we are just beginning at the fugue section, and we're going to hear the beginning of this so you can hear a contrasting performance.
Harpsichords, right?
Yeah.
I thought I had it queued up, but it's not.
Yeah, you need to cue it right to the fugue.
Try.
Well, actually, if you don't have a cue, just play it from right there. That's fine. Just play it from the beginning.
Okay.
We're not going to listen to the entire thing. I just want people to hear a portion of it. Pause it there. Now I wanted a different section, but the same point will be made by the two. Same piece, different instruments, completely different approach. Now, this was the method, that is what was played by Schiff in specific, was the method that LaRouche used to build his organization. It was not built by program. It was not built by policy. It was not built by polemic. It was built by a conception of thinking, which was in specific distilled and implemented in his organization in the period, specifically in 1973 and 74. It was there before that, and it was there in LaRouche's work in economics. But during that period in particular, there was an antidote to what was otherwise a rampant disease which had been observed in the United States and generally, and it was called the counterculture. LaRouche essentially took a group of young people, myself included, who were advocates of that counterculture and demonstrated by means of this method why that culture was bankrupt. And it was that culture which had to be overthrown for us to have any ability to convey anything about any other idea we ever had. Without that capability, we would not exist today, nor would there be, for example, organizations like the Schiller Institute. Now, what was it that we were fighting against? This you've heard before, some of you, but it's of relevance here. Aldous Huxley, 1961, quote, "There will be, in the next generation or so, a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorship without tears, so to speak, producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies, so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods, and this seems to be the final revolution." The significance of that is that American or Anglo-American military policy, as we think about it, has been shaped by that precise orientation in terms of the training of troops and the psychological conditioning of troops. And it was to this in specific that Lynn spoke at the time of 9/11, after we waited for a period of about 6 months before we produced anything. We refused to engage in what was, in fact, a very low-level discussion, although well-meaning, by many people about how 9/11 happened. It still goes on. We don't have that view of 9/11. In this pamphlet produced at the time, Zbigniew Brzezinski and 9/11, we described the problem of the character of the military that was being created and had been created over a period of time from about 1945 through 2001. And specifically, what we're referencing here is the plan called Operation Drop Shot in the case of the United States in 1949, but called by Bertrand Russell simply the idea of destroying the Soviet Union then by bombing them with nuclear weapons. It's this orientation which is the one we are attacking. It's the one that you see today in the film American Sniper, but it's also what you see in the film about to come out called 50 Shades of Grey. They're the same thing. And both of them are characteristics of the new military. So in Zbigniew Brzezinski and 9/11, LaRouche, at one point, he begins to describe the way in which a person by the name of Samuel Huntington, who was a protege or sort of a sidekick, sort of Sancho Panza to Zbigniew Brzezinski's Don Quixote. He wrote a book called The Soldier and the State. And Lynn used that book and its orientation as the way of describing the character of what had actually occurred around 9/11 and what had happened before 9/11 and what had now happened in American military, or not American, but Anglo-American military thinking. So he says this: "The increasing dependency on aerial bombardment, including more and more emphasis on a range of extremes, from massive dumping of dumb bombs to over-the-horizon platforms, such as drones, for example, represents not so much the advantage of air superiority as a loss of the ability to effect traditional forms of politically viable control on the ground. While these changes are deemed progress by some, the effect of substituting policies of obliteration for control on the ground mean that superpowers will tend to be attacked wherever they can be conveniently targeted on the ground, i.e. terrorism. then in the ironical age of superweapons, armed conflicts shift more and more in the direction of parodies of Stone Age conflict, which of course is exactly what you see. That's what the torture policy is. That's what all this eye for an eye stuff, like for example, the Jordanian pilot being burned alive in a cage, and then the Jordan responds by executing 2 people, and then the Jordan president quotes Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven to go through what his policy is going to be, which is what actually happened. Yeah, it's happened. Yeah. Toward I'm going to kill your mother and your children and your wife and all this is the thing that he said at the end of the movie. Thus, in the ironical age of superweapons, armed conflict shifts more and more in the direction of parodies of Stone Age conflict, a trend whose ultimate result is not imperial supremacy, but the disintegration of would-be empires under the corrosive onslaught of the general slide into a more or less planetary New Dark Age. It's simply worth briefly just referencing, just as an aside, that if you take the careers of Tiberius, of Caligula, of Claudius, of Nero, and the subsequent emperors of Rome, all of them die violently. None of these people who do what they do live to tell about it. So when you talk about this idea of absolute rulership and this uniform kind of character of dictatorship, the people who perpetrate it are themselves always destroyed in the fire of chaos they themselves create. Which is the way to understand someone like Barack Obama. Which is why we have said what we said about Barack Obama. And why one must understand why we are saying now that Barack Obama has to be removed. Because his proclivity will be to remove himself.
Yes.
And he will do that through a thermonuclear method. Now, one has to understand that this is not only real, but this is an evaluation which is shared between LaRouche and members of the Russian establishment in particular. And it was something that people in the British psychological warfare divisions knew, which is why he was placed where he was placed. Because he is a credible ultimate threat. So it's like a suicide bomber, right? Yeah. A suicide bomber is a credible ultimate threat. And unless you have a credible ultimate threat, then the idea of nuclear war as a viable option doesn't actually occur to your adversary as being, what's going to happen necessarily. In other words, the Russians, they have a military doctrine, they have had one. But certainly they did believe, even with Bush 43, remember Putin's phone call to Bush at the time of September 11th, a phone call which he could not now place to Barack Obama. That cannot occur. But so that even in that case, they thought, or they recognized, that Bush would not be capable, probably, himself, of launching a thermonuclear attack. But this is not that. Obama is not that. Later on in this particular edition, Lynn says the following. He says, the military figure which emerges from the prevalent fog of Huntington's definitions. He's talking about the book, The Soldier and the State, but we're going to skip all that. The military figure which emerges is a parody of that pathetic fascist of Napoleon's defeated army who was typified by the emperor-worshipping grenadier of Heinrich Heine's poem, Die beiden Grenadier. Now, we're not going to go through that now. There's a song by Schumann, famous song. And basically, there's 2 grenadiers, and they're coming back from the fight in Moscow. The whole army's been decimated, and one of them is saying, look, it's over, and, I only wish that I was dying as well. I got a wife and child at home, I have to get there, and that's the only reason I don't want to die. And his friend says, what do they even matter? Let them go beg if they're hungry or cold. My problem is that the emperor is in jail. We have to get him out. And he says, promise me one thing, my brother. If I go to my death, you take my body to France and make sure I'm buried in French soil, put the cross of honor over my heart, and then put my musket in my hand and my sword beside me, and then I hope that the emperor rides over my grave, and if he does, I will rise from the dead. I will rise from the dead to fight again. And what Lynn says is, this is the fascist. This is the fascist mentality. And he says, self-appointed apostle of democracy, Huntington is in practice a fascist. He is a declared prophet of a specific kind of fascism, universal fascism. He proposes a universal fascist world empire, which lures its deluded henchmen with the magical vision of a coming period of a worldwide American empire, one parodying that of the self-doomed ancient Rome, which you will never see. Lynn doesn't say that, but I'm telling you, America is never going to see that. That's the delusion. That's what's being offered. But we will never see that. The intention is completely a different one. And the idea is the idea of absolute destruction. Now, in this regard, we've written a lot of things. But the Congress for Cultural Freedom is the element that I want to just reference here. I already said a couple of things about this thing about the nuclear question, so let me make sure I don't skip one element of that I really want to make sure is clear. From the time of 46, some of you know, Bertrand Russell made various statements about the idea of dropping nuclear bombs on the Soviet Union. And in one such statement, this was written after Hiroshima, and was written to his mistress, whose name is Gamelle Brennan. Quote, there is one thing and only one thing that can save the world. And that is a thing which I should not dream of advocating. It is that America should make war on Russia during the next 2 years and establish world empire by means of the atomic bomb. Okay, there are no atomic bombs in the Soviet Union at that time. Okay? Now, the American plan for that, which was its first version. The later version was called Operation Drop Shot. But in 1948, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff had another version, which was called Charioteer. And the plan called for the United States to, quote, initiate strategic air operations as soon as possible after the outbreak of hostilities by launching a concerted attack employing atomic bombs against governmental, political, and administrative centers, urban industrial areas, and selected petroleum targets within the USSR from bases in the Western Hemisphere and the United Kingdom. Now, there are no nuclear weapons in Russia at this time. The first nuclear weapon is going to be exploded in 1949. This is 1948. So just so we're clear about that. The United States would use 333 atomic bombs against the Soviet Union, which did not yet possess atomic weapons. Even so, the conclusions of the Joint Chiefs were that there were no guarantees that the Soviet Union would be defeated. See, now what we're dealing with, we really deal in the realm of madness, which is why I'm quoting these things so that one understands what this is about and why it's important to understand that we are quoting the realms of madness, but we have to understand that this was something that was consciously, deliberately promoted, and the way that it was promoted was through culture and through the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and specifically through music. The specific way it was done was through music, and the person who was given that responsibility was an individual by the name of Theodor Adorno. Now, you won't know so much about him, but he was a co-author with Max Horkheimer of something called The Authoritarian Personality. This was a book which was a study of how to destroy the United States that had produced FDR. That the conception was that there was a problem. The British had financed Hitler for the purpose of destroying Germany, or Russia rather, going east and destroying Russia. And then the idea was to employ the United States on behalf of the British Empire in a war to destroy Hitler. In so doing, the United States would also destroy itself, and you would simply have a generally sort of globally extended empire. And the empire would be ruled by chaos. Now, this element is something that it's important to recognize. The notion is perpetual war is a method of control, of rule. And the way you make it a method of rule is through a banking system, which controls debt. In other words, in warfare, everyone needs weapons. Everyone needs to be financed to have weapons. So the idea is if you have a sort of globally extended set of imperial banking centers, which are masquerading as countries, things like Kuwait, for example, which is obviously not a country, other places like this, or offshore areas. You have these sort of, or even garrison city-states, which are called military bases, instead of nation states. Then what you can do is you perpetuate rule by perpetuating indebtedness. And you simply employ various forms of militaries as tax collectors in different ways. And you have a kind of a Venetian form of intelligence services, and the intelligence services constantly trade information and espionage among one among the other. So that this gives you a way, this is a form of imperial rule, where in other words, the emperor is always a designate by a series of powers. The principalities and powers designate the emperor. The emperor is actually not really ruling. There are kings and so forth in each of the individual cities. They're monarchs. But there is an emperor who represents the globally extended interest of the empire as a whole. And that's how you rule. And that was the way that the British understood through Gibbon's work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, what the Roman Empire had done, but also what it had not perfected. To perfect it, you needed what Huxley talked about, the final revolution. So Adorno wrote various things. I'm just going to go through a couple of quotes from him, from his philosophy of modern music. Relevant here to know is that he was in Hollywood at the time that he wrote this, and he was writing Hollywood scores together with Stravinsky. So these things were being implemented as they were being said. So this is Adorno talking about the purpose of modern music. Keep in mind the shift performance as you listen to this. What radical music perceives is the untransfigured suffering of man, the seismographic registration of traumatic shock. Just think about any heavy metal concert. The seismographic registration of traumatic shock becomes at the same time the technical structural law of music. It forbids continuity and development. Musical language is polarized according to its extreme toward gestures of shock, resembling bodily convulsions on the one hand, any Beyonce performance, for example, and on the other, towards a crystalline standstill of a human being whom anxiety causes to freeze in her tracks. Any number of dead rock stars. Modern music sees absolute oblivion as its goal. It is the surviving message of despair from the shipwrecked. Its concern is to dominate schizophrenic traits. Let me go back a little bit. It is not that schizophrenia is directly expressed therein, but the music imprints upon itself an attitude similar to that of the mentally ill. The individual brings about his own disintegration. Just think about any computer, people self-programming on the computer. He imagines the fulfillment of the promise through magic, but nonetheless within the realms, goes on, some other stuff. Now, he's the one that invented Top 40 radio. Adorno invented that with the Princeton Radio Research Project. And the idea was that it was a small, it was a kind of a popularized musical expression of imperial rule. It's called the tyranny of tolerance. You create 40 different types of noise, but they're all popular. So people like it, and they vote for it. And by getting them to vote for it in some fashion, then they have to defend it.
Oh,
That was the idea. Now, meantime, there's something else to say about the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Just trying to go both quickly and keep a continuity here. This is from something you can get on the internet if you're interested, which asked the question, did the CIA finance rock and roll? It says this. The CIA was paying for the publication of books and articles by plenty of ex-communists and others with leftist leanings and Marxist pasts. The CIA showed a willingness since its inception to fund whoever made sense as a tool, regardless of the political climate, and despite the politics of those funding. As the 20th century wore on, it seems safe to assume that the CIA continued acts of cultural propaganda. Well, just to be understand it, the Congress for Cultural Freedom was entirely financed by CIA. And I'll tell you more about who they are in a minute. They're relevant to the Russia situation, which is why we're going through this. We know something of what they did in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but nothing after that. This book, The Cultural Cold War, which is on the Congress for Cultural Freedom, only covers that period of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And it just says, an informed guess, an informed guess will point to rock and roll and its various offshoots as an obvious art form to fund. I won't go through and keep reading this because I just want to give a couple of examples of something here. Because I'm going to stay on the military element of the point. Some people are familiar of something called the rock, drug, sex counterculture. Let's just cite something. This is a sort of an interesting and useful article, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but you'll get the drift of it here. It is the first week of August 1964. U.S. warships under the command of U.S. Navy Admiral George Stephen Morrison have allegedly come under attack while patrolling Vietnam's Tonkin Gulf. This event, subsequently dubbed the Gulf of Tonkin incident, will result in the immediate passing by the U.S. Congress of the obviously pre-drafted Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which will in turn quickly lead to America's deep immersion into the bloody Vietnam quagmire. Before it's over, well over 50,000 American bodies will litter the battlefields of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Now, what happens is, they point out, this was not a false flag incident, which is to say an operation that involves a country attacking itself and then pointing an accusatory finger at somebody else, like Hitler's invasion of Poland, which was that. That was a false flag incident. It was also not an attack that was quite deliberately provoked. No, what the Gulf of Tonkin actually was an attack that never took place at all. Now, why are we reading this? Never happened. Nothing ever happened. The entire incident was spun from whole cloth. You can go online and there's all kinds of stuff you can read on this. Okay? The reason we're talking about it is that the Admiral, Stephen Morrison, is the father of Jim Morrison of the Doors. Now, let's just talk about a few other people quickly. We're going to leave my friend Frank Zappa for last. He's sort of an interesting person. Okay, John Phillips. You guys ever heard of Papa John Phillips, the Mamas and Papas, right?
yeah.
Okay, so let's see. He is the son of U.S. Marine Corps Captain Claude Andrew Phillips. His mother claimed to have psychic and telekinetic powers. John Phillips attended a series of elite military prep schools in the Washington, D.C. area, culminated into an appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. His mother worked for most of her life for the federal government in some unspecified capacity. His brother was in the Marines, but more importantly, he claims that he was involved. Here's what he says. Before succeeding in his musical career, John did seem to find himself quite innocently, of course, in some rather unusual places. One such place was Havana, Cuba, where Phillips arrived at the very height of the Cuban Revolution. For the record, Phillips has claimed that he went to Havana as nothing more than a concerned private citizen. Goes through. It says that he ended up getting kicked out of there, but for unspecified reasons. Stephen Stills, Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Let's go to that. Now he is also, his father was military. We find it exactly here. Yep, raised in Texas, spent a lot of his childhood in El Salvador, Costa Rica, Panama Canal Zone, various other parts of Central America. He claimed, it says here, Stephen will later tell anyone who will sit and listen that he served time for Uncle Sam in the jungles of Vietnam. But the problem is, the period where he says he was in Vietnam was before we had troops committed. That, however, is completely doable because some of our members actually know all about that, about the Laos War in particular and some of the other stuff that happened. And Stephen Stills has claimed that that's what he did. And then finally, David Crosby. He's the son of an Annapolis graduate and World War II military intelligence officer, Major Floyd Delafield Crosby. Right? And we could go on like that for a while. Frank Zappa's father was chemical warfare specialist. And was in charge of, and worked at the Edgewood Arsenal. Although in the case of, but I won't qualify. Who's qualified? This is Laurel Canyon. I go through this because these are the people who create what's called Laurel Canyon, California, in Los Angeles, which is where the base of the counterculture, which you think about in San Francisco, the commercial base is Laurel Canyon. And out of this comes the mega records, rock, drug, sex counterculture. I'm citing it merely because the idea that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was merely a Cold War project is inaccurate. It is a Cold War project, but it is also a project that intended, through MKUltra and through the things that you associate with that, to in fact enslave the mind. And that's what it did. So now, having said that, let's just briefly touch on Facebook. Some of this stuff is stuff you know, but I want to just indicate something about that relative to today and come now back to the military point on the financing of Facebook in particular. Peter Thiel contributed $500,000 to start Facebook to Mark Zuckerberg in 2004. He began his career as a founder of the Stanford Review. That's important. The flagship publication of William F. Buckley's Intercollegiate Network. So he's right-wing. Okay? He made his money with Credit Suisse Bank and also from PayPal. He's today on the board of what's called the Vanguard PAC, whose mission is to promote right-wing Federalist Society members. That was back 10 years ago in the period around the right after the Iraq War. But I cite that because Facebook is now, as I think people know, over half of the adults in the United States are on Facebook. Timothy Leary made the point before he died that the perfection of LSD, or what was being done through the process of getting people to take LSD, was for him the internet. He said the reason for this is that what you are trying to do is you're trying to create a universal brain. The concept is everyone plugged in and everything about them plugged in, and in real time everything about them being exchanged. And so what happens is that the individual effectively disappears, not because he can't be individualized or there are not individual particular proclivities or whatever that are expressed, but actually everything is being powered by the universal brain. And they're just basically hooked into some set of options that are provided, which are relatively infinite on the part of that universal brain. And the level of both stimulus, not intellectual, but brain stimulus through various means that you can manipulate with this is considerable. Now, LaRouche came up against this, and he knew he came up against this from the very beginning. Matter of fact, one of the first things written by LaRouche is called The New Left, Social Control, Local Control, and Fascism. And what it was about was the fact that LaRouche had noted that the radicals that were calling themselves leftists actually bore striking similarity to the shock troops of the Nazi SA, which was the left wing of the Nazi Party, and that they were capable, under certain circumstances, of being led in a direction, especially through terrorism, which would allow a right-wing phenomenon to emerge in their own ranks. Now, he was talking about the Weather Underground at that particular point, and he was talking about other manifestations that came up later, like the Black Liberation Army and some of the other things that we encountered. Let me point out, before I go too far with respect to this, that we have on occasion met individuals that were in these organizations, and sometimes those individuals have no idea what they were in. We also, however, as an organization, explicitly fought and destroyed these operations, which was what our purpose was. Our first deployments were down in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, to defend the United Federation of Teachers against exactly this operation, being run by Black nationalists down there, Sonny Carson and some of the other people who were involved, and also by Meir Kahana on the other side, who founded the Jewish Defense League supposedly to fight against the Black nationalists who were beating up the teachers, but it wasn't a pro-union thing. He just turned it into a racial thing. It's just a Jewish-Black standoff. But the reason for that, this is 1968 I'm talking about. The reason for that is that if you know the history of the Civil Rights Movement, you know that the Jewish component of the Civil Rights Movement was indispensable to anything that was accomplished in the Civil Rights Movement. It wasn't that everything done was done by people who were Jewish, no, but it was that element, both in terms of organization, not merely, quote, money in this, but the orientation of those who had either survived the Holocaust or were radicalized before that and found themselves in some fashion fighting alongside African Americans whose movement was never a black movement. In the case of Martin Luther King in particular, the Civil Rights Movement was never that. The Black Power movement was a black movement. And that was created, as we know from the testimony of certain of our associates, one-time associates like Roy Innes and others, that the Black Power movement was created for the purpose of dividing the Civil Rights Movement and was financed by the FBI and the Central Intelligence Agency. The foundations, such as Ford Foundation and others, did this in particular. But in order to stay focused and not go too far afield, let's now go more back into the military element of this, what we're looking at. I'll simply name a character that some of you have heard, or you remember the name, but you've forgotten his name, Timothy McVeigh. Oh. Timothy McVeigh, who referred to himself as Luke Skywalker. Yeah, Luke Skywalker. Because he saw, right, so for those who now understand that idea, he saw himself as part of a new military, a new conception of American military. By the way, for those who are interested, you can either get the book, which is probably it's better, but the movie's not that bad, The Men Who Stare at Goats. The Men Who Stare at Goats is about this precise phenomenon of the so-called, psychological troops or the psychic troops or whatever they're called of the American Army. Jeff Steinberg has written a few articles about this. These are the spoon benders, is the way we've referred to them. The people who are doing, the remote viewing and the other stuff. Now, what this is
goats like an animal?
The Men Who Stare at Goats. It's an idea that if you keep staring at the goat long enough, you can basically kill him by staring at it.
Okay. Oh, I thought you said goats.
The men who stare at goats. Who stare at goats. The men who stare at goats. That's what I said.
G-O-A-T.
G-O-A-T-S. The men who stare at goats. Right. So now, because in other words, there's something to be understood about this form of mysticism attached to militaries. If you look at the SS of Hitler, remember that the SS's other name is the Order of the Death's Head. The SS was a Freemasonic order, which was organized and spent a significant portion of its time searching for the Holy Grail during the war. This is true, yeah. And this is why they were going to places like Monte Cassino and some of the other monasteries and so forth. They were looking for the Holy Grail. Because the notion, and they were looking for the spear of Longinus, the spear of Longinus is the spear that pierced the side of Christ. And the idea was that the blood that flowed down from the spear gave the spear magical powers. This was the other thing that we're looking
What
for.
about the Ark of the Covenant? Where did he put that too?
Well, that's Spielberg's thing, but the same idea. The point is that these people were lunatics. They're crazy, right? And this is why they were the fanatically devoted of Hitler's troops. These are the people that you also put in charge, either directly or indirectly, right, with the concentration camps. And of course, Reinhard Heydrich's final solution, which was basically to be implemented through the SS largely, although administratively it was a little bit different, from 1942, January 1942. Because it was known, the Wannsee Conference, the conference where they actually sat down and talked about this. You can get a copy of the actual proceedings of the Wannsee Conference, because despite the fact everybody was told to destroy their copies, one Grunewald German, right, who just couldn't destroy his copy, kept it. And that's why we know about the final solution. But it was the SS that was considered to be the most reliable. And the SS, in part, you see, here's what their notion was. Their notion was that the Jews were going to be reincarnated as Aryans.
Aryans?
Yeah, that the Jews were Jews because they had done something wrong in a previous life. And that's why they were Jews, and that they had to be a burnt offering, a Holocaust, in order to come back purified. That's why it was called the Holocaust. That's why it was the Holocaust.
So they're doing them a favor.
Yeah, but that was the idea, okay? Yeah, it wasn't personal.
It wasn't
Right.
It wasn't personal, right? Just you got bored, this in theory, you know. So think about it this way. When you die, you may come back better.
Well, they did actually.
No, they didn't actually.
No, the Jewish don't control everything.
No.
I don't know. I'm asking
No.
you a question. Sorry
That's
to
right.
interrupt.
No, that's fine. I'm glad you brought it up.
Sorry.
See? But you got to bring it up. No, the point, here's the idea, and here's the point of the narrative that we're doing here, so-called. It's not a narrative. I use the term facetiously, and I use it because LaRouche detests it. And we're trying to get underneath something, and it's this. Since 1945, there's been an attempt to turn the American military and the American establishment, intelligence establishment, into a form of the old SS, or variations, a universal fascist tendency. The British are the ones that have been doing this because they were the ones that were doing it in the first place. They were the ones that financed Hitler, and they financed many others. Many others. Because their notion was never that, see, fascism, remember, was new in 1920, 21, 22. You know, Mussolini sort of invented something, right, which was a form of dictatorship, but it wasn't the only one that they were financing. They also were financing Bolshevism. Even though I happen to be partial to Lenin individually, you know, the fact of the matter is, the truth is that Wall Street, including the Lamont family in particular and others, were financing Stalin, or rather Bolshevism as such, and also fascism. And the reason was this. The American system is a republican system. The American system of Hamilton establishes sovereign, independent, republican nation states with credit systems that allow them to perpetrate prosperity.
Yes.
You can commit prosperity according to the law. See, it's no longer against the law to actually develop the general welfare of the people of a nation. Now, against that, banking oligarchies and even landed aristocracies as well wanted to undermine that tendency, because in the case of the United States it actually worked, and it had been proven to work not only in the case of Hamilton's America, but in the case of Lincoln's America. And then again, once again, in the case of Roosevelt's America. So this was a little bit too much. This is 3 times that it was proven that the United States, despite the looting process of war, despite the devastation of war, could actually emerge from that process stronger. And in the case of Lincoln's 1861 to 65 prosecution of the war, He literally created a stronger economy in 1865 than he had in 1861. And in the case then, they all say the same thing happened with respect to Roosevelt. Once nuclear power was actually harnessed in the form of the atomic weapon, it was recognized that thermonuclear fusion power must be immediately next. And what has been the case is that ever since the 1940s, the battle has been on the question of thermonuclear fusion. The Russians create the first fusion bomb, first hydrogen bomb. And without going through all the details of this, because it goes far afield and we don't need to get into it, we've tried to make the point continually that, the Fusion Energy Foundation of LaRouche and LaRouche's orientation toward controlled thermonuclear reactions ends oligarchical systems, because oligarchical systems of the modern era depend on geopolitics. The theory of Halford Mackinder and others of geopolitics, as was written up in Mein Kampf of Hitler. That is, you have to have minerals, strategic minerals, raw materials, and so on that are indispensable and located somewhere in some piece of dirt. And you fight for the piece of dirt. You fight in some fashion for the land mass, for the Eurasian land mass, the Eurasian heartland, or whatever, which is the basic theory of Karl Haushofer and Mackinder in a different way. And that all the world politics is all about the Eurasian landmass, which, by the way, Zbigniew Brzezinski was one of the big proponents of. His grand chessboard is one example of that. Now let me simply say with respect to Brzezinski and Obama, because now we come to Brzezinski, Huntington, Obama, and now we'll bring it back to where we have to be. Brzezinski was the executive director of the Trilateral Commission, first executive director in 1973. He is the national security advisor for Jimmy Carter in the Carter administration, which is the Trilateral Commission's first administration. He is also the originator of the jihadist impulse in Afghanistan, where he went to the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan and gave the famous speech in 1979 in the summer, calling for a jihad against godless communism. And this is when we were supporting what were called the fiercely independent Afghan freedom fighters, which is what you now call various things. You call them Al-Qaeda, you call them ISIS, you call them all these other things. Well, we did that. And individuals like John Train of Wall Street was the head of the Afghan Relief Committee, was the person that would, in 1983, organize downtown here at his place a 30-person meeting to create what was called the Get LaRouche Task Force. They were the people that put LaRouche in jail. But it was John Train who was operating on behalf of this operation in specific, the Afghanistan operation, because he was a money conduit for it. So this is Brzezinski 79. Now Brzezinski, remember, is not only the grand chessboard. Remember that Huntington is his sidekick at Columbia, and that Huntington is the author of The Clash of Civilizations, the thing about Islam versus Christianity, and Huntington is the author of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, emergency management legislation of the 1974-75 period. But Brzezinski is also the first establishment figure to endorse Barack Obama. He is the central figure that pushed Barack Obama. Back in 1977, we wrote a pamphlet, which I could not find, which was called The Aquarian Conspiracy, and it has a picture of Brzezinski on the front of it. This is the book that we were referring to at the time by Marilyn Ferguson. The Aquarian Conspiracy, Personal and Social Transformation in Our Time. And I won't go through a lot of things about this. The book is completely explicit. It was sort of a Reader's Digest guide to every intelligence agency that was an operation that was brainwashing you at the moment you were reading the book. And that's sort of what it was at the time. It came out in the 1980 or so. But I bring this up because Brzezinski was the politician he was the operative. He was the Masonic knight that spoke about what he called the technotronic age. In other words, a transition from what we would call industrialism to post-industrial society, but which would take on this sort of computerized technocracy view, where the technocrats become the heads of state. Like Bloomberg, for example, in the Maryland. See, he's got so much money, how could he be corrupt? Well, wait a minute. To have that much money, you got to be corrupt. So you know, this sort of thing. And he managed the city, quote unquote, managed. It wasn't really, you know, he sort of could talk to anybody. Well, because basically he'd already slipped them $40,000 or $50,000 before the conversation began, and therefore everyone would talk to Bloomberg. And that was why, for that 12 years that he was in power, you could get nothing done in New York City. The reason we have a Manhattan Project largely is because he's gone, not because anybody good is there now, but his simple absence has allowed New Yorkers, to begin to wake up and begin to do some things. So just now to like draw it now to the conclusion of what I want to say. So the military policy, culture, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, I just want to say two things about it, to be specific. If you were to ask anybody about it historically, what they're going to tell you about is an anti-communist operation that basically was all about showing that that Russia, that Soviet Union, was intent upon world conquest. That's what people would associate with it. And I'll just, so you have a sense as an image, just refer here to the day that it got its wings, which was 25th of March, 1949. There was a meeting at the Waldorf Astoria, and the meeting was called by a sort of Russia, was called Cultural and Scientific Conference for World Peace. And it was basically a bunch of fellow travelers of the Soviet Union. They were coming there, and there was people like Lillian Hellman, Clifford Odets, Leonard Bernstein, Dashiell Hammett, Corliss Lamont, so forth and so on. They were all coming to the meeting, right?
Theater people.
Now, on the opposite side, okay, they had a suite upstairs. Let's go through this. And in the suite were Sidney Hook, Mary McCarthy, Nicholas Nabokov, brother of Nabokov, the novelist, Arthur Schlesinger, the poet, well, actually the wife of the poet Robert Lowell. So I'm going to now just give you an idea, and David Dubinsky of the ILGWU. Okay, now this is the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and what they're there to do is to protest against all these people that are trying to organize this Conference for World Peace. Now, this is March of '49. Now, what the relevant thing to say is that during this year, the Russians will explode an atomic bomb. By this time, they've already told Paul Robeson, among others, about Operation Drop Shot, but they've told it to him in the form of charioteers. So Robeson is briefed on this. What Robeson is doing is he's going around at different world conferences in different locations denouncing the United States for a plan to blow up the Soviet Union, to go to war with the Soviet Union. He's just saying, and he makes the statement, no American Negro will go to war with Russia, or something like that along that line. Not quite that simplistic, but that's what he's saying. This becomes an incident or set of incidents that gets him disappeared. You know, in other words, from 1950 to 58, he will find himself unable to travel anywhere. The State Department just pulls his passport because his going around and doing this is too effective. And he doesn't get his passport back until 58. He's completely grounded. His career is completely, effectively just wiped, almost airbrushed out. You know, people who know about him, but people who, right? And if you ask anybody basically under 30, they have no idea who you're talking about. And he went from a person of great stature in America to nothing. This is the sort of thing that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was doing, and it was alternately financing all sorts of people. By the way, many of them had no idea they were being financed. People like Jackson Pollock, the painter, were being financed by the Congress for Cultural Freedom. They didn't know. People like our friend Imamu Baraka, Leroy Jones, he was being financed by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, their little literary magazine. Right? Because they were spreading so much money around, anything that was weird, they would finance. because the idea was cultural freedom meant distract everyone, go in a different direction, and keep people preoccupied. There's a particular quote from Adorno, and then I think, or no, this is actually from Adorno and Horkheimer. This is from The Authoritarian Personality. A-D-O-R-N-O, Theodore, A-D-O-R-N-O. Yeah, he was a member of what was called the Frankfurt School, and the Frankfurt School guys basically taught at two places, Columbia University and the New School for Social Research, where Lyndon LaRouche also taught, and that's another story which is itself interesting. But I just want to read the last part of what they report. See, they're talking in their report about fascist potential in America, and they want to stop that. See, that's what they're saying, and they say, we need not suppose that appeal to emotion belongs to those who strive in the direction of fascism, while democratic propaganda must limit itself to reason and restraint. If fear and destructiveness are the major emotional sources of fascism, eros belongs mainly to democracy. Let me read that again. If fear and destructiveness are the major emotional sources of fascism, eros belongs mainly to democracy. Which brings me to 50 Shades of Grey. Now, what is going on in the United States is that there is a sexualization of torture. Because in order for the actual crimes committed in the Iraq War to become sacred in the American mind, what they want to do is now create this connection. And the connection is between sex and death. It's called necrophilia, love of the dead. Now, see, people will think about the literal idea of necrophilia. No, don't go there. Think about the vampire crazes.
In the TV now,
The sexualization of Dracula, for example, which has been going on for a long time now. I mean, that's been like the, and this is a lot of this, you know, and the whole killing me softly notion and right? So all that is what they mean by eros is at the center of democracy, because everybody knows one of the best ways to distract people's attention, and if you take the internet, then it becomes like virtual sex, sex twice removed, third derivative sex. You have a derivative trade in sex. Huh? Why is this important to military affairs? Well, because if you've got a country which is droning people and bombing people and is doing this with impunity, and then you make American Sniper the new hero, somebody that's killing somebody that can't shoot back, doesn't even see them. And this is the new American hero. If you're doing this, what you're trying to do is create a cultural preconception or precondition in which these actions are permitted. It's the idea, it's the Nietzschean idea of all is permitted.
It becomes acceptable.
Now, the American population, and come back now to LaRouche, because often we've talked about music and we've talked about what we do with classical culture, and I know that this is often not understood in the way we're saying it. A lot of people understand a lot of what we're saying about it, but they don't see it the way we see it. We won our war to exist. The reason we can deploy on the streets and organize and do all the things we do, which people ask about all the time, where does the energy, where's the dedication, where's the inside, where does the soul come from? It comes from this. It comes from being rooted in something which is a classical, what we call the classical culture, but all we mean by that term is that it's human. And that it has various manifestations. It could be all sorts of things. And we've made the point often in our literature and otherwise that there are various folk and related expressions of this. We always talk about the African American spiritual, for example, as one example of that. But there's other all over the world. The Korean art song, for example, there are songs in China. There are many other manifestations of what we refer to as classical culture. What it refers to, what we're talking about, is reason is at the center of it. Reason is at the center of it, and that you're trying to develop. The conception is that you develop a notion of life itself as a work of art. But where that is in sort of the way that the aesthetic principle, the aesthetic education of the emotions, the development of the capacity to not tolerate, but empathize. See, which is different. Right? Catharsis is not cathexis. The ability to actually connect, not just to the suffering, but to the greatness of other people in other cultures, which is what we keep running into whenever we bring up this thing with the BRICS nations. Well, we keep saying, well, but the Russians are, oh, but the Chinese are, but well, Islam is. And these are people you know never even, like, they couldn't even find a Quran. They can just barely spell Quran. Not that the Quran is a great book, it has some good things in it. There are some bad things in it. But I'm saying they haven't even read it. They have no idea what it means to say an Islamic culture, what the Islamic culture did, or expressions of that, or Andalusia. They don't know any of it, right? But I'm not here to make an obvious point. The chorus that we're doing, for example, in New York, is the very bedrock of our entire ability, will be the bedrock of our entire ability to organize the city on anything else. You can only get Glass-Steagall or the other things that we're trying to get by building that chorus. And the reason is very simple. People are being bombarded by what we just talked about. This is now the culture. These guys won from that standpoint. I mean, just in various ways. And you can do a little experiment for yourself, which is an easy one to do. Go to your radio and just go down the dial and then see how many times you encounter a classical music station playing classical music.
Maybe one.
But maybe, because yeah, what are they playing?
Copeland.
See? Okay, all kinds of stuff is on there, right? So now how did that happen? But yet you'll be able to hear 5, 6 different country and western stations, except that doesn't even sound like country and western anymore. Now that sounds like Motown used to sound, except it's just white, or kind of white. Right? Sometimes they're doing hip hop. I mean, and if you go to these different, and if you go to the jazz station, well, you gotta get some 75-year-old who basically knows anything about Charlie Parker or whatever. And you have that crazy, what's his name, Phil Shat. He can give like a lecture about it, and everybody goes to sleep on him. So you can't even hear that. In other words, the old bad forms of music can barely even be found. Most of what you're hearing is some homogenized version of even that which used to be real. So now, what is the conception behind it? I just want to use one last quote here, just because it will sort of summarize, and then we'll go into the final, right at 5:40. And I want to play, well, I think we're okay actually on the music. We did that already. This is from a man by the name of Antonin Artaud. He wrote something called No More Masterpieces. He died in 1946, born in 1996. He had a lot of problems in his life. He was a drug addict. Okay, here's what he says. I destroy because for me, everything that proceeds from reason is untrustworthy. I believe only in the evidence of what stirs my marrow, not in the evidence of what addresses itself to my reason. I have found levels in the realm of the nerve. I now feel capable of evaluating the evidence. There is for me an evidence in the realm of pure flesh, which has nothing to do with the evidence of reason. The eternal conflict between reason and the heart is decided in my very flesh, but in my flesh irrigated by nerves. Now, I read that kind of thing because you can find statements like that scrawled on the internet by every crazy serial killer that basically you're reading about today. Things like that. Things that because what has been induced in the population is what used to only be found in elite literary circles of the avant-garde in Paris in 1924. Now you can get this on any bathroom wall. You can find this if you look in, you know, a Jane Fonda book in the ShopRite. You know, it's actually true. Take a look at her last book. So anyway, in summary here, what are we doing? What are we up to? What is Manhattan? What does this have to do with what we call the Manhattan Project, and next week in particular? What has happened, as you know, is that we've now reached another level in this BRICS process. I think everybody was briefed in part on the collaboration, in part we are beginning to see with our organization and some of the BRICS nations. And that was in evidence yesterday. Now, we're running something now that begins more and more to look like LaRouche's old organization. In the old LaRouche organization, the idea was the destruction of the icons. We were a Gideon's army. Our idea was we looked not for monsters, we looked for icons. We looked for pagan statues. And we followed the first commandment. And our idea was everything pagan goes. Not because we're against pagans, or we happen to be against pagans, but the point is not even because of that, but because they're false images. It is not true that reason is counterposed to emotion. That's itself false. No. It is only when reason and emotion are one idea that there is creativity at all. There's no thinking involved. And that's exactly sort of, just I think, one last thing from Lynn. In his comments about Huntington, this is just on academia, the difference between us and the academics, okay? Because we are not academics. He says this, and this was the sort of statements, these are the sort of statements that endeared Lyndon LaRouche to some of us, particularly myself, when we would hear him write things like this. There are statements you would only hear sort of from Lynn. He's talking about Samuel Huntington's book, The Soldier and the State. And he says, from the outset, the literary quality of Huntington's text would have best served the goal of giving both mediocrity and Harvard a bad reputation. His style of argument is that of logical positivism seeking to caricature itself. It has the characteristic footprint not of an original thinker, but the authentic spore of an academic sycophant from the ranks of William Yandell Eliot's golems. Eliot was the head of Harvard. The method of argument which he employs is a parody of arbitrary, slippery-footed, ivory-towered definitions delivered as if from before a blackboard to some sorry set of terminally credulous students. Unfortunately, his manifest want of the ability to actually think is the least of his book's problems. As I learned 56 years ago during military service in Asia, the most stupid among the species of snakes may be the most poisonous. Now that's the kind of stuff that endeared us, because Lynn has a way of layering an insult. Just over, and see, and he's just gonna go over and over, and he's just getting started. See, he can do that kind of thing for a page, 2 pages, 3 pages. Why? Because he actually detests this idea of culture, of pluralistic, tolerant, liberal, irresponsible, right, rejection of reason. That is the idea. See, he hated that. And that was what we, in the form of our polemic around the BRICS nations, are adopting. In other words, thermonuclear fusion is right. It may not be the case everybody knows about it, but we know about it. We know that this relieves the ability, the need rather, for poverty throughout the world. We know that it can permanently eradicate oligarchy, and we know that people's general welfare can be safeguarded in this way. Geopolitics ends, empire ends. This is a republic of the mind as opposed to an empire of the mind. And this is an American method which Hamilton uniquely allowed our country and our people to test and then begin the process of perfecting, and a process of perfection which continues and which is part of what we're going to be doing and are doing with the BRICS nations. So we are not going to wait for somebody to come into the White House because there's nobody, doesn't look like anybody is available. Okay? We're not really even going to wait for the Congress. Matter of fact, a couple of congressmen have now caught up with us and saying, okay, we'll work with you. Because that's the American principle, that's the American revolutionary principle, and that's the higher cultural principle that Lynn and his organization has exemplified or tried to exemplify for over 4 decades. Okay, so that's what I have.
Thank you.